Hey everyone. So for today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the Constitution. We're going to be looking at how the Americas moved from the Articles of Confederation and created a government which has lasted 232 years. As we saw in the previous lecture, the Articles of Confederation were really simply just a weak and wimpy government. They had no executive, no judicial branch. They had no power to raise an army, no power to tax. The federal government was simply just too weak to get anything done. So in May of 1887, delegates from the colonies met at the Philadelphia Convention. And this was basically a convention where they were going to get together and talk about aspects, things about the colonies. But when they got together, they realized that their goal was really to create a new, stronger government. These people were scared by mob rule, particularly Shays' Rebellion, which we saw, which is the uprising in Massachusetts, and that they really had no power to stop. And they thought that the states were too selfish and divided to govern the country. Remember, in the Articles of Confederation, you had to have all states to pass a law to amend the Constitution. They felt like the states were too self-involved, that they needed a stronger national government to control everything. The challenge for these delegates and for these founding fathers was the idea of creating a balanced government. So they wanted something stronger, a more centralized national government than what was laid out under the Articles. But they also wanted something weaker, less centralized than the British government. Remember when they created the Articles, the reason they had done that was to have a less powerful government. They didn't want to have just replace one king with another powerful central government. So they created a really weak government, but it didn't work. So they had to make something a little stronger. So they're trying to figure out the right balance between that. So what they were really looking for was something that could be described as strong but weak. That seems kind of like a contradiction, but in a lot of ways it's really not. So they wanted a strong, centralized government, enough to manage the nation's problems, to stop pirating, to stop British impressment, to be able to raise taxes, to be able to raise an army, to be able to manage commerce, these things, the problems they were having under the Articles. But they also wanted a weak, decentralized government, enough to guarantee that the new government would not violate people's rights like they saw under British rule. They didn't want to violate those natural rights that they had written out in the Declaration of Independence. So one of the first things they had to do was create the idea that federal law is the supreme law of the land. Law no longer relied entirely on the states. There was now a federal government, a national government that would have power over the states. So they were going to be supreme. It was going to be centralized. But they had to figure out really how to balance this power. Now that they decided that they did need a more powerful national government. One of the first aspects they added to this idea was the idea that um, men must register for the draft. They had to be able to raise an army in times of crisis. Remember in Shays' Rebellion, they had no way of defending the armory. It was basically a private army which had defended the armory. So they were left with the idea that they had no way of stopping pirates. They had other problems on a national level that they needed an army for. So people had to register for the draft. That was one of the first ideas when they thought of how to create a strong centralized government, was the idea of raising an army. So one of the key aspects they needed to face was the idea of creating a more decisive and effective government. They needed to replace the problems that they had seen under the Articles with only having one branch, the legislative branch, the voting, the branch that would pass laws. And so in Article 2 of the new Constitution, they created an executive branch, which would be the presidency, the President of the United States. And so that would be basically like the boss, the person, the branch that ran the government. And then in Article 3, they created the judicial branch. They created the courts. So this gave more structure to the government, gave more power to the national government. So when the founders created the Constitution, they believed that the legislative branch was going to be the strongest branch of government. This would be the branch that had the most power, where the representatives and members of Congress would pass laws and they'd be the most powerful. But what they did, and so they set aside the powers of the legislative branch in Article 1 of the Constitution. And one thing they did in this was they delegated certain powers that were given to the national government, that were given to Congress. So what that idea is, basically they say that these are the powers that Congress has. And amongst those powers was the power to regulate interstate commerce. They could regulate trade between the states. They could trade business that was run in the states and went from state to state. That was a problem under the Articles of Confederation. They had no way of regulating that. So that was one of the delegated powers that they gave to Congress. And one of the reasons you see right here, this is a picture of child labor during the Industrial Revolution. And this practice was ended by Congress by using their power to regulate interstate commerce. They outlawed the use of child labor. So if you remember, under the Articles, two of the biggest problems were they didn't have an army or a navy, and they had no ability to tax or have a national currency. So they gave the power to the national government to raise an army. They gave control of the army to the executive as a commander in chief of the military. And they also had the ability to raise a national tax and to create a national currency. So that way, you could have money, you would get out of the debt. You could also pay for the army, but you could also have a currency that could be used throughout the colonies, throughout the new states. So the framers created the judicial branch in Article 3 of the Constitution. And this was kind of just the head court of the land. They would hear trials, different things. But it wasn't until under Chief Justice John Marshall, several years later, that the Supreme Court became very powerful. Under the Marshall Court, the court's power grew immensely. So it was actually in the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803, so 16 years after the Constitution, that the idea of judicial review came into principle. So what is the meaning that the American courts had the power to strike down laws, statutes, and some government actions that violate the Constitution. So that means that the courts are basically the judge. The Congress will pass the laws, the executive, the president enforces the laws, and then the courts interpret whether the laws are constitutional, whether the laws follow the ideas set within the Constitution. And that is the idea that comes out of that case in Marbury versus Madison in 1803 and really expands the role of the courts and of the Supreme Court. So this power of judicial review would have a very important impact on several aspects of American history going forward. The idea of separate but equal comes out of a Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, in 1896. In this case, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation laws for public facilities as long as the segregated facilities were equal in quality. And this created the doctrine of separate and equal, but this set in line the idea in the South that they could have those Jim Crow laws, that there would be segregation. The Supreme Court's power of judicial review was also used to overturn segregation. In the case of Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation laws in public schools were unconstitutional, even if the segregated schools are otherwise equal in quality. Basically, the idea of separating people based on the color of their skin makes it unequal, inherently unequal. So therefore, they overturned segregation, and this kind of led to desegregation, the civil rights movement. So the Supreme Court was responsible for that. The Supreme Court has become extremely powerful based on this case, Marbury versus Madison, and the expansion of the idea of judicial review. In the case of Gibbons versus Ogden, this is a case in 1824, but it basically confirmed that the Congress had the power to regulate interstate commerce. And so you see that in the case here, the Apple versus Samsung patent trial. But court judges, business matters. They actually are allowed to judge business. They're allowed to regulate business. So it makes it extremely important. So the framers and the founders obviously couldn't write down every single power that they felt the federal government would have in those delegated powers. Those are the most important ones. But they also knew that government had to be able to adapt and have to have different powers. So they wrote the necessary and proper clause, which is also known as the elastic clause. And this is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. But this gave the federal government certain implied powers. These are political powers granted to the U.S. government that aren't explicitly stated, as I said. They're implied to be granted because similar powers have set a precedent. These powers are necessary for the function of any governing body. So you have to have the government be a little flexible and be able to do things that aren't necessarily defined explicitly in the Constitution. So one of the big cases that kind of established the power of the Elastic Clause is McCulloch versus Maryland. In this case, basically, Marshall's Court ruled that the Constitution, they had the power, the federal government had the power to create a national bank of the United States, and that the state of Maryland did not have the power to tax that bank. So that gave the federal government power and supremacy over monetary policy. So we can really see the elastic clause at use in two of the examples shown in these pictures. So the picture on the left is from 1957 at Central High School in Arkansas, in Little Rock, Arkansas. So 9 African American students were going to the high school for the first time after the landmark court decision in Brown versus Board of Education desegregating schools. But there was a lot of opposition to the desegregation of schools, and it was also actually illegal still under Arkansas law. The state authority states are usually given the right to handle education. That is their power. But what was happening is President Eisenhower decided to send in the National Guard because he saw it as necessary and proper to defend the right of these students to go to school. And then on the picture on the right, you see a car from General Motors. And what happened is during the Great Recession in 2009, General Motors was about to go bankrupt and collapse. And President Obama felt that they were so necessary for the economy, trying to get the economy back on its feet, that he authorized the government to buy General Motors, practically nationalizing it, making it a national company before turning it back over. This is a power that he deemed was necessary and proper, but had never been applied before. So the framers were trying to create a stronger government that had more power, that had power to control things that had gone bad under the Articles. But they were still very afraid of creating a dictatorship, giving too much power to the national government that would rule over the states with an iron fist. That's why I have a picture of Hitler there. He's kind of our stand-in dictator for everything. So the idea was to really stop the government from becoming too abusive. And this was laid out, really the idea for this and the plan for this was laid out in the Virginia Plan, which structured the government, created the basic structure of a government. The Virginia Plan was written by James Madison in 1787, and the plan was created so that it would inherently limit the power of the central government. So the plan that James Madison lays out in the Virginia Plan that will inherently limit the government is the idea of separation of powers, which he borrowed from Baron de Montesquieu, an Enlightenment philosopher. But the idea is that inside the government, you create different spheres of power so that one aspect cannot get overly powerful, cannot gain influence and control over everything. And these separate areas of power have checks and balances so they can check on the other branches, on the other spheres of power, so that one cannot become overly powerful. The separation of powers lies in those different branches of government that were created in Article 1 with the legislative branch, Congress. You see there Congressman Senator Mark Warner. The executive branch, which was created in Article 2 of the Constitution, to the President Donald Trump, and then the judicial branch created in Article 3 of the Constitution. You see Chief Justice John Roberts of the Supreme Court there. So all three of these branches of government have power, and the idea is that they're all supposed to check on each other. So that creates the idea that government will not be able to gain too much power. An example of the checks and balances is the idea that Congress makes laws. Congress is the legislative branch of the government. They're the ones that pass the laws of the country. But the president has the power to veto those laws, and the courts have the ability to determine the constitutionality of those laws. So basically decide if those laws can stand or not. So they're able to check the power of Congress in that way. The framers also wanted to maintain a good amount of the state power as was originally intended under the Articles, but they just wanted a national government which could have certain powers over that state government. So this is the idea, you get the idea of federalism, that there are two levels of government, state and national, that support and check each other in certain ways. So it was actually with the 10th Amendment of the Constitution that it was defined, the idea of reserve powers were defined, and that the powers that are not delegated to the national government, to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So that is an idea that if it's not explicitly designed or delegated to the national government and it's not prohibited, that the states will have those powers, those are the reserved powers. Have certain powers. States have the power to regulate transportation. They set the speed limits. They control the roads. They do get national funding, but they're able to set their laws. So these are two issues which the states decide on. The idea of marijuana legalization is largely seen as a state issue now. The federal government still has marijuana listed as an illegal substance, as an illegal drug, but many states have legalized it either medicinally or recreationally, and the federal government is simply not enforcing that. It's allowing that power to the states. States are also given the power to manage marriage license, and certain laws of that degree. States also have some really strange laws that they're allowed to have. So in West Virginia, it is illegal to whistle underwater. You're not allowed to do that. In Arizona, donkeys cannot sleep in bathtubs. I mean, that's a sensible law. In Texas, you cannot sell your eyeball. In Maine, there's no Christmas decorations after January 14th. That one actually might make some sense. And then in North Carolina, elephants cannot be used to plow fields. So there's some really strange laws that obviously aren't delegated, aren't given to the national government, but they're also nothing that's prohibited in the national government. So states are allowed to have these laws. Another important ideas that comes out of these protections from a centralized government is the Bill of Rights. What the Bill of Rights does is guarantee individualized rights of citizens. So those are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, which were added to the Constitution to protect people's basic rights. So that's where we get our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion, right to bear arms, right to due process, right to speedy trial, things of these manners. So what this does is take away those powers from the government and gives them to the people. So that's obviously a big idea coming from coming from the Enlightenment philosophers from like John Locke, and those ideas basically giving the people the rights, defining their rights within the document. So James Madison was really integral in this idea of giving the people a Bill of Rights. And of course, with anything, there's going to be differing views. As I saw in the articles, the states could not get along. So, there's delegates compromised in order to create an effective government. There were big states and small states, the North and the South. There were a lot of different ideas, different desires for power that these states and delegates had, but they had to figure out ways to compromise, ways to create a better, more effective government. So at the convention, George Washington actually presided over the convention as the president of the convention, and James Madison is seen as the father of the Constitution. A lot of his ideas went directly into the Constitution. The biggest compromises that came out of the Constitutional Convention and that really influenced the government was the so-called Great Compromise. This balanced the interest of large and small states. So there were two plans. Part of the Virginia plan put forth by James Madison was to have Congress be a body represented by population. So that is, the more people you have, the more representatives you have. Of course, Virginia was the largest state at this point. And then there was another plan, is the New Jersey plan, that wanted equal representation from every state. So every state would have two Congress people. So basically what the Great Compromise does is create a bicameral two-part legislative branch which takes each of those. The House of Representatives that we have is represented by population. So the larger the population of the state, the more representatives you have. California has the most representatives in the House of Representatives. The Senate is created with equal representation. You have two senators from every state. So you see Wyoming there, which has 500,000 people, has the same amount of senators as California. What that does is help to equal the interests of the large states and the small states. It's a single Congress with two chambers. The House of Representatives has 435 representatives, and the Senate has 100 representatives. So that is part of the Great Compromise, the idea that you split it, you take both ideas and you put them together so that way the larger states have some power, more power, and some of the smaller states have power. One of the compromises we need to know from the Constitutional Convention is a 3/5 compromise. And this compromise balanced the interests of northern states with southern states. The southern states wanted to count their slaves as population towards representation. So they wanted to count all these people they had enslaved to have better representation in the House of Representatives. Of course, the northern states did not want this. That would have taken away their power. And the way they looked at it is they were like, yeah, slaves are human beings, but the South does not treat them as human beings. You enslave them. You treat them as property. So what they came up with at the convention was the idea of counting slaves as 3/5 of a person. So a slave would count as 3/5 a person, so it would add up to give them a number towards the amount of representation inside the House of Representatives. But one thing they did too in the Constitution was they created an idea that 20 years after the Constitution was enacted, that there would be no more slave trade. So that's where you get the 1808 importation ban. That is the idea that slaves could no longer be brought from Africa to the United States. However, there was already a large slave population and growing slave population within the South. So this did not really hurt any of the institutions of slavery that existed in the South. So over 4 long months in the summer of 1787, the framers of the Constitution, these delegates, worked in Independence Hall in Philadelphia in the hot summer, locked away so they would not be influenced from the outside, creating a new government. And so what came out of this was the Constitution of the United States, the document we still use today, 232 years later. And so one of the stories goes after they came out, after they had crafted this document, a woman comes up to Ben Franklin in the street and asks, what have we got? Basically, what government do we have? And Franklin replies, a republic, if you can keep it. And so what Franklin means here is that they have created a system in which it's a representative system. It is no longer the idea of a direct democracy. Often people think that America is democracy. It is, but it's also a republic. We elect representatives to represent us. And that's what a republic is. So they learned the lessons from the Articles, the ideas of giving too much power to a democracy. Remember how they feared democracy after Shays' Rebellion. So they created a republic to give power to the people, to guarantee some power to the people, but also to keep some power to the federal government, to allow the federal government to have power. And it's also key to look here what Franklin says, if you can keep it. This is a difficult system to maintain. As we will continue to see, it doesn't always go smoothly in American history, and it has lasted amazingly 232 years, but it has come very close to crumbling several times. So as we move on, we will see some of the trials and tribulations of this republic formed by the Constitution.